The storm had been moving since dawn, a white wall crawling across the plains like something alive. And by the time Caleb Rowe realized he was riding straight into its heart, the world had already begun to disappear, the horizon erased first, then the sky until horse, man, and land were swallowed in a roaring blur of snow and wind that burned the eyes and clawed at the lungs. And Caleb pulled his hat lower and leaned forward in the saddle, murmuring low to the horse beneath him, a big dun named Ash who trusted him enough not to panic even as the temperature dropped so fast. The air itself felt brittle, the wind howling, like a warning meant for someone else, because Caleb had grown up learning to read weather the way other men read books. And this storm had come wrong, sudden and mean, a betrayal of a morning that had begun calm and pale, and now he was a long way from any town, riding fence lines that blurred into nothing, the landmarks he knew by heart swallowed by snow, until he spotted something that did not belong, a shape, dark against the white, barely moving, and for a long second he thought it was a fallen steer or driftwood carried far inland by some miracle, until the shape shifted and he saw an arm lift, then fall, slow and weak, and his chest tightened as he swung down from the saddle without thinking, the cold biting instantly through his gloves as he trudged toward the figure half buried in snow, boots sinking deep, every step an effort, until he dropped to his knees beside her and saw a woman, her face blue with cold, lashes crusted white, her coat torn and useless, blood frozen at her temple where she must have fallen, and she tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, her eyes unfocused yet stubbornly alive, and Caleb swore softly, under his breath, because this land was unforgiving and winter showed no mercy, and anyone left like this would be dead within minutes. So he shrugged off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, lifting her with a grunt, surprised by how light she was, all bone and resolve, and carried her back to Ash, tying her carefully to the saddle horn with practiced hands, shielding her face from the wind as he mounted up and turned the horse into the storm, riding blind now, trusting instinct and memory and the quiet bond between man and animal, the world reduced to sound and sensation, the creak of leather, the snort of the horse, the relentless scream of wind, until at last, after what felt like hours, but could not have been more than 20 minutes, a shape emerged from the white line of trees, a low cabin crouched against the earth like it had learned humility from the land itself, and Caleb slid from the saddle again, half dragging, half carrying the woman inside, slamming the door shut against the storm, the sudden silence almost painful, the air inside cold but survivable, and he worked fast, laying her near the hearth, striking flint with shaking fingers until fire caught, then rubbing her hands, her feet, speaking to her in a low steady voice even as doubt crept in, because he'd seen men freeze stiff within sight of warmth before, and when her eyes finally focused on him, truly focused, there was something sharp in them despite the cold, something assessing, and she whispered a name he didn't catch before slipping into unconsciousness, and Caleb sat back on his heels, breathing hard, staring at the stranger he had pulled from death without knowing why. Only that leaving her there had never been an option, not for him, not ever. And as the storm battered the cabin walls and night began to fall like a closing fist, he had no way of knowing that this single act, this instinctive refusal to turn away, had just tied his fate to a woman whose name carried more weight than any brand, burned into cattle flesh in the entire territory, though for now she was just a life balanced on the edge, and he would spend the next hours feeding the fire, melting snow for water, and watching her chest rise and fall, unaware that the blizzard outside was not the most dangerous thing moving toward him when she woke. Again it was deep night, the fire low and crackling, shadows dancing across rough-hewn walls, and Caleb was mending a strap by lantern light when he heard the sound, a sharp intake of breath. Controlled but startled, and he turned to see her pushing herself upright, with visible effort, pain flashing across her face before it was masked, and she looked at him like a woman used to command, even now, even weak, her gaze steady and unafraid, and she demanded to know where she was, her voice hoarse but firm, and Caleb answered simply, naming the land, the storm, the cabin, offering her water without fuss or curiosity, and she drank slowly, studying him over the rim of the tin cup, noting his plain clothes, his careful movements, the way he gave her space without withdrawing entirely, and she told him her name was Eleanor. No last name offered, and he nodded as if that were enough, because out here names mattered less than actions, and she asked why he'd saved her, as if the question were a test, and he shrugged, replying that she'd been dying and he'd been there, and something unreadable crossed her face at that, a flicker of disbelief or relief, before exhaustion dragged her back down, and hours passed in a strange quiet punctuated by wind and flame, until morning crept in pale and weak through frost-rimmed windows, the storm having moved on as suddenly as it arrived, leaving the world buried and hushed, and Eleanor woke stronger, though still pale, insisting on sitting up, asking questions now: how far to the nearest town, who owned this land, how long winter usually held, and Caleb answered without suspicion, unaware he was sketching the edges of a territory she knew better than most, though she hid it well, asking him in turn about himself, about his work, and he told her little, that he rode fence, fixed what broke, stayed where he was needed, and left when he wasn't, and she smiled at that, a small private smile that suggested she understood, more than she let on, and when she noticed the coat around her shoulders was his, patched and worn, she fell quiet, fingers tightening in the fabric, and said nothing, though something settled behind her eyes, something heavy and deliberate, and later, when she stood unsteadily and moved to the window, looking out over the land with a familiarity that should have struck him as strange, she whispered a thank you not just for the rescue but for the way he had done it, without questions, without conditions, and Caleb waved it off, turning back to his work, unaware that outside, beyond the hills and frozen draws, men were already searching for her, riders sent out at dawn, driven by fear, loyalty, and power, and that before the day ended, his quiet life would be interrupted by the thunder of hooves and the weight of truths he had never asked for, because storms did not always announce themselves with snow, and wine sometimes they arrived wearing human faces, and this one had just begun. The sound came first as vibration more than noise, a distant trembling in the earth that Caleb felt, through the soles of his boots, before Ash lifted his head and snorted, ears angling toward the door, and Caleb straightened slowly, hand resting on the table as he listened, counting the beats without meaning to, knowing that rhythm the way a man knows his own pulse, and Eleanor felt it too because she turned from the window, her shoulders stiffening, her calm cracking just enough to let urgency through, and she said quietly that riders were coming, not asking but stating it like a fact already accepted, and Caleb nodded, because the land carried sound far when it was frozen like this, and soon the thunder resolved into individual hooves, many of them hard-driven, disciplined, and Caleb's first thought was not fear but inconvenience, because strangers brought trouble more often than not, and he moved with the unhurried precision of a man used to choosing his steps carefully, sliding his rifle from its hooks, not to threaten, but to have it near, while Eleanor pulled the coat tighter around herself, color rising to her cheeks as if resolve itself were warming her. And when the knock came, it was not a knock at all, but a heavy, authoritative pound that rattled the doorframe, followed by a voice calling her name, not Eleanor, but something else, something formal, a title wrapped in concern, and Caleb's brow furrowed as he opened the door a crack, the cold knifing in, revealing half a dozen riders outside, well-armed, well-mounted, their horses fit and restless, their coats bearing clean stitching and good leather, men who did not ride fence, or mend what broke, but commanded others who did, and the one at the front stepped forward, eyes sharp, relief flashing openly when he saw Eleanor standing behind Caleb, alive, upright, and he said her full name then, the sound of it heavy with authority and possession, and the world shifted for Caleb in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, because names like that carried echoes, and even a man who kept to himself knew which names bent land around them. And Eleanor closed her eyes briefly before stepping forward, placing a steadying hand on the table as she did, and she thanked them for coming, but told them she was safe, her voice carrying the kind of command that did not need to be raised, and the men relaxed instantly, tension draining like water from a cracked barrel, one of them removing his hat, another glancing toward Caleb with open curiosity now sharpened by something like calculation, And Caleb felt it then, the invisible measuring that happened when power noticed you, weighing your worth not as a man but as a variable. And Eleanor turned to him, meeting his eyes, and in that look was apology and gratitude and something else, resolve, sharpened by inevitability. And she told them he was the one who had saved her, had ridden into the storm and pulled her from death without knowing who she was. And the lead rider studied Caleb anew, respect flickering there, but also a dawning awareness that debts like this did not remain simple. And Caleb tipped his hat, slightly uncomfortable with the attention, already sensing the shift in the air. And within minutes, the cabin that had held silence and survival was crowded with boots and breath and authority. Eleanor, wrapped in a finer coat, offered a horse, a flask, assurances, and when she mounted, steady despite the pain she must still be hiding, she looked down at Caleb one last time and told him she would not forget what he had done, that such acts were rare, and rarer still were those done without expectation of reward. And he shrugged. Again, that same plain gesture, saying it hadn't been for reward. And she smiled then, truly smiled, and said that was precisely why she would see him again. And then they rode off, the sound of them fading across the frozen land until silence reclaimed the place, leaving Caleb alone with ash and the dying fire, staring at tracks that cut through snow like a question he had not asked, knowing only that something fundamental had changed, though he could not yet name it. And he spent the rest of the day repairing fence and mending tack with a restlessness he did not recognize, replaying the sound of her name spoken with reverence, the way those men had moved at her word. And that night, as he lay staring at the ceiling while wind whispered over the cabin roof, he understood that the blizzard had not passed cleanly through his life. It had left something buried, waiting to rise. And far away, Eleanor rode home across land that answered to her will, already issuing quiet orders, already planning, because men like Caleb Rowe were not accidents. They were answers, and she intended to honor the debt she owed, not with coin, but with truth. And when dawn broke over the territory, it did so on a future already set in motion, one that would test loyalty, power, and the cost of doing the right thing when no one was watching. The first sign that Eleanor's promise had teeth came not with ceremony, but with dust, a low rolling cloud rising on the horizon 3 days later as Caleb worked a broken gate, ash tide nearby, the winter sun pale and sharp above. And he paused, squinting, heart sinking a fraction, because riders rarely brought good news unless they were lost. And these were neither, their formation tight, their pace deliberate. And as they drew closer, the details sharpened into unmistakable signals of wealth and reach. Well-bred horses, rifles clean and oiled, coats bearing brands he recognized now that his mind had begun connecting pieces he had long ignored. And when they stopped short of him, the man at their front dismounted with an ease born of command, introducing himself as a steward of Eleanor's holdings, speaking her full name again without hesitation. And Caleb felt the invisible line between his old life and whatever came next stretched thin as wire, because the steward did not ask whether Caleb would come with them. He merely stated that Eleanor wished to see him, that arrangements had been made, that his time and labor would be compensated. And Caleb stared at the gate he hadn't finished fixing, at the land he knew inch by inch, feeling the weight of a choice that had already been made for him the moment he lifted a stranger from the snow. And after a long breath he untied ash and nodded once, because refusing would not put things back the way they were. And the ride that followed carried him across miles of territory he had skirted but never entered, past fences that ran straight as law, past herds so vast they moved like living weather, until the ranch itself rose before him. Not a single house, but a small town anchored by a main lodge, built of stone and timber, solid enough to defy generations. And Eleanor stood waiting on the porch when he arrived, bundled against the cold but unmistakable in her stillness, eyes sharp, posture unyielding. And she greeted him not as a subject or a curiosity, but as an equal, thanking him again, formally this time, in front of witnesses, naming the debt aloud, so it could not be forgotten or minimized. And when she invited him inside, the men around them watching closely, Caleb felt the quiet pressure of 1,000 unspoken questions, because power did not often bend down to acknowledge a man like him unless it intended to use him. And over the next hours, Eleanor did not disappoint in her honesty, laying out the truth she had hidden in the cabin that she owned the largest ranch in the territory, that her influence reached courts and councils alike, that her disappearance in the storm had already stirred enemies who smelled weakness, and that she needed someone outside her usual circles, someone uncorrupted by loyalty bought or inherited, to help her see what her empire had become beyond the polished reports she received. And Caleb listened without interruption, absorbing the scale of it, the way her gaze never wavered as she spoke of betrayal, of foremen who skimmed, of enforcers who brutalized in her name, of a legacy built by her father that she was determined to reclaim from rot. And when she finally asked him if he would stay, not as a hired hand, but as her eyes and conscience on the ground, the room seemed to hold its breath, because this was no offer of comfort, but of danger wrapped in responsibility. And Caleb thought of the storm, of the choice made without thought, and he said yes, not because he wanted power or proximity to it, but because he had seen what happened when good people turned away. And in the weeks that followed, he learned just how sharp Eleanor's enemies were, how deeply fear had taken root among workers who had forgotten kindness, and how quickly rumors spread about the cowboy who had walked into the heart of the territory and not been swallowed. And there were nights when threats came whispered on the wind, days when confrontations turned violent, moments when Caleb questioned whether one man's integrity could truly matter against systems built to crush it. Yet Eleanor stood firm beside him, weathering backlash with a strategist's patience and a survivor's steel, trusting his judgment even when it cost her. And slowly, painfully, the ranch began to change, overseers replaced, debts forgiven, brutality punished, and loyalty redefined not by fear but by fairness, until the inevitable reckoning arrived in the form of a coordinated attempt to seize control. While Eleanor was away inspecting distant holdings, a move meant to end the experiment decisively, and Caleb rode hard through the night to warn her, snow beginning to fall again like a grim echo, arriving just in time to stand with her before a gathering of armed men and frightened workers. And when the confrontation peaked, when guns were raised and lines drawn, Eleanor stepped forward and spoke not of ownership, but of responsibility, naming every injustice, every betrayal, and offering a final chance for those who had followed orders blindly to choose differently. And Caleb's presence at her side, silent, unflinching, became the fulcrum on which the moment turned, because the men who had once doubted her resolve saw now that she inspired loyalty not by force, but by example, and the rebellion collapsed not in bloodshed but in surrender. The ringleaders exposed, the threat broken, and as winter loosened its grip and spring crept back across the plains, the territory whispered a new story about power exercised with restraint and courage. And Caleb, standing once more at a repaired fence under a widening sky, understood that saving a life in a blizzard had not just altered his path, but had reshaped a world. And Eleanor, watching the land she loved begin to heal, knew that the greatest asset she owned was not measured in acres or cattle, but in the quiet strength of a man who had acted rightly when no one was watching, proving that true ownership was never about control, but about care.